All right. Welcome to episode 56 of the Jake Blanchard podcast, brought to you in part by Stream to Sea. They're known best for their reef safe and biodegradable sunscreen. They also make a wide variety of personal care products. Why Stream to Sea? Because they aren't putting harmful chemicals or estrogen mimicking toxins in their products. I started reading labels after Mike Malter came on the podcast. I was absolutely blown away. And we forged a partnership. My family made the switch. Yours can too. Use the code JBP at checkout. Get 10% off at streamtosea.com. Also, we're brought to you by our friends at Fellowship Brand, premium men's grooming products. They make oils, balms, butters for your beard. Their tattoo balm is amazing. It's all natural. I use it daily. Check out their website to learn more, fellowshipbrand.com. Also, code JBP gets you 10% off. My guest today is Brian Bogert. He is a passionate human behavior and performance coach. He's a speaker, a business strategist, a top sales professional, and a philanthropic leader who believes in helping growth-minded individuals achieve the best version of themselves, which is their most authentic selves. And he teaches people how to leverage radical authenticity, which I'm so excited to talk about, radical authenticity, what that means, and how that can manifest in someone's life, to create awareness and intention so that people can create the life that they've been dreaming of. So he's got a revolutionary strategy he's going to talk about a little bit today around embracing pain and avoiding suffering. That and more coming up in a minute. Brian, welcome to the podcast, my man. Excited to have you.
Man, I'm excited to be here, especially after being connected a couple months back. It's cool. I'm excited about this, man, and going to pour some value into the lives of everybody who's listening today.
Dude, I know you will 100%. But first, like you're in Phoenix, aren't you?
I am. Yeah.
Two big things going on in Phoenix, like 300-degree weather and the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, both are hot. Neither one of them I'm paying attention to right now, to be honest.
I know, man. I was like, what can I talk about Phoenix? I was like, weather and the Phoenix Suns, but certainly they got a good playoff run going.
No, we do. I mean, it's pretty incredible. What's so funny though, I was talking to my wife last night, like something after this shift over the last year, I'm literally I have no clue what's going on in sports at all.
Same here.
For whatever reason, I just like completely ratcheted back. I have no clue. And everybody's like, oh, how are the Suns doing? I'm like, I don't know. My brother was at the game last night. Talked to him this morning. I was like, did they win? He goes, no. I was like, oh, sorry. Like, I'm a fan and a supporter, but for whatever reason, my focus just got totally dialed in a different direction this last year.
It's funny. As I was prepping, I was like, man, I know the Phoenix Suns are in the playoffs, and I look them up and I'm like, oh, they're pretty deep.
Yeah, like pretty deep in the playoffs.
So that's good, man. And then that weather's certainly not treating you guys the best down there. 105, 108, 100,000 degrees.
Yeah, I'll take anything under 110 though. We had a week 2 weeks ago that was in excess of 110, and anything above that, you just start to melt. So, yeah. It's good, brother.
Well, hey, our mutual contact here in George Bryant happened to connect us. Got to see you speak in Montana at George's event around relationships beating algorithms. And one of the things that I found just kind of profound about you is that you're deeply self-aware, which I imagine is both a blessing and a curse. And we can get into some more of that. But your journey, your story, your life has moved me deeply. And I'm hoping that you'll share some of that, kind of given your background, where you're from, and some of the things that have helped shape your perspective early on to kind of round out the background I provided.
Yeah, so let's just hit that hard out of the gate, and then we'll see where we want to take it, okay? Just for perspective so that people know, the thing that's not in my bio that's probably my most important roles is as a husband and as a father. So I have to at least start that. Like if we're going to get into who Brian is, that's hands down my most important role. A little bit about my backdrop. I've got two amazing, incredible parents, a brother who's 14 months older, and, had a really cool opportunity to live across the world multiple times before the age of 5. So I was in Australia, I was in England. We really got to understand kind of from an impact perspective and perspective, right? What it looked like in different parts of the world, even at young ages, we were able to understand that. And I want to go ahead and jump into a story, and I'm going to ask you and everybody who is listening, unless they're driving, of course, to close their eyes for just 1 second and just stay with me for a second. I'll tell you when to reopen them. I want you to imagine going to a store, having a successful shopping trip, heading out the door, walking outside, looking up at the sun, feeling the warmth of the sun on your skin, the breeze through your hair, and a little pep in your step because you just know you're going on with the day. You get to your car, you're fumbling around for your keys. And as you're getting ready to unlock the doors and go on with your day, you turn your head and you see a truck barreling 40 miles an hour right at you with no time to react. Go ahead and open your eyes. That's where this portion of my story begins. My mom, my brother, and I went to our local Walmart to get a 1-inch paintbrush. And as we head back to our car, anybody who spent more than 2 minutes with me knows I've always had this crazy energy in life. And so, of course, I was the first one there. I wanted to get that paintbrush to use. And so as I was standing next to my car, my mom and brother a few feet behind me, I was waiting for them to catch up to unlock the doors. But this was back in the days before key fobs. So I literally had to wait for her to come up, physically grab a key, stick it in the door, turn it so that we could go on with our way. And as I was standing there waiting, a truck pulls up in front of the store. And driver and middle passenger get out. And the passenger all the way to the right felt the truck moving backwards. So he did what any one of us would do, Jake, and he scooted over to put his foot on the brake. But he instead hit the gas. Combination of shock and force threw him up on the steering wheel, up on the dashboard, and before you know it, he's catapulting 40 miles an hour across the parking lot right at us with no time to react. Now we were in an end spot. So he goes up and over the median, up and over the tree in the median, hits our car, knocks me over, runs over me diagonally, tears my spleen, leaves a tire track scar on my stomach, and continues on to completely sever my left arm from my body. Wow. So we were just talking about that Arizona heat, right? There I was laying on the parking lot in the middle of August on a 115-degree day here in Phoenix, Arizona. My mom and brother watch the whole thing happen. They look up and they see my arm laying in the parking lot 10 feet away. Fortunately for me, my guardian angel also saw the whole thing happen. You see, there was a nurse that walked out of the store right when this took place, and she saw the literal life and limb scenario in front of her. And I am forever indebted to this woman for choosing to move into action versus turning her head and going on with her day. She came over and stopped the bleeding at the main wound and saved my life. And she instructed some innocent bystanders to run inside, grab a cooler, fill it with ice, and get my detached arm on ice within minutes to give me a fighting chance of having a reattached arm. Had she not done one or both of those things, I either wouldn't be here with you today or I'd be here with you today with a cleaned up stump. Like, that's just the reality, right? So I know you've heard my story. So you were expecting it to go there today, but I know our listeners were not. They were not expecting it to go there today. I know I have an extremely unique story, but I want you to set that aside for just a second and realize that all of us have unique stories. What's important is that we pause and become aware of the lessons we can extract from our stories and then become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. And we all have the ability to do that. And we also all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of everybody else's stories and lessons so that we can shorten our own curve to learning. So I'll share with you 2 primary lessons, and then we'll jump in and go wherever we want to go.
Awesome.
The first is I learned early not to get stuck by what has happened to me, but instead get moved by what I can do with it. You see, moved people move people. The second lesson I learned is this idea that although I was blind to it for a long time at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, although I was the one having surgeries to me, although I was the one having to do the therapy, I was also being guided through the process. So I was a little bit in the fog. My parents were not. My parents were intimately aware of the unceasing medical treatments, years of therapy, and the idea of seeing their son grow up without the use of his left arm was a source of great potential suffering. So they willed themselves day in and day out to do what was necessary, to do what was tough, to embrace the pains required to ultimately strengthen and heal me. So whether it was intentional or not, what they did was they ingrained in me a philosophy and a way of living, which was to embrace pain to avoid suffering. And I believe when this is done correctly, that's also where we gain freedom. So it's these 2 lessons that I use to not only overcome this unique injury, but how my business partners and I scaled our last business to over 15 million within the span of a decade. And now how I flipped that on its head as a human behavior and performance coach to help individuals and organizations just like you, just like the people listening, become more aware, more intentional, and who they already are, their most authentic selves. You see, I believe that's when the door cracks to perspective, motivation, and direction, and joy, freedom, and fulfillment can enter into our lives. And it's these reasons that all of our entities are focused on impacting 1 billion lives by 2045. Because I genuinely believe if we can reduce the level of suffering on this planet, allow people to experience joy, freedom, and fulfillment holistically in their lives, that's where vulnerability and authenticity will come back into the forefront, which, oh, by the way, those are the 2 pieces of glue that bind human connection. And that is what's going to allow individuals to stand on their own 2 feet, not just confident in who they are, but convicted in who they are, knowing that the world's not going to just accept them for who they are, but embrace them for who they are. That's where we create a much more sustainable and joy-free and fulfilled world for our kids and our grandkids, Jake. So that's what I'm doing today.
That's incredible, my man. That's, deeply moving story. Like, you were around 7 years old when this happened?
I was 7, yeah.
You were 7 years old. And so, one of the questions that first came to mind for me was, you experienced some very physical trauma going through this. And, a lot of us, including myself, go through emotional trauma in our lives, as your childhood growing up. Can you kind of Do you have a difference in your mind of like what the difference is in that physical trauma, something that someone can see, something that someone has questions about, having to confront it on a regular basis or talk through it, versus the scars that people have internally when they're...
Yeah, so you just gave me chills on a very deep level by even asking that question the way you did. I think you're aware, but I have to point out, Jake, like that is an incredible question. And I don't think that there's dramatic differences, truthfully, but I think that we give ourselves narratives that there are. And I don't think that our ability to truly understand and separate physical trauma versus emotional trauma is easy for us to do. So I'm going to do the best I can, okay? Because that's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
And it's a great question that I think is worth pursuing. I will tell you that I believe that all of us have our own innate capacity to cope with anything, right? And when the demands of our environment or the demands of whatever trauma or whatever situation exceeds our ability to cope, we start literally shutting things off without our even knowledge that we're doing so, because it's a pure survival technique. So for me, highly physical, right? This also forced me to get into my body. But I'll tell you that at 7 years old, at 8 years old, at 9 years old, at 10 years old, at 11 years old, I got very used to seeing the shock and awe and jaws drop on people's face when they asked me innocently what happened to my arm. As it was in a sling, they were expecting I fell off a jungle gym and broke my arm. And so I had to also really harness with the fact that every time I said that to somebody for the first few years, nobody believed me, and they would immediately look to parents to validate whether or not I was telling the truth. So already I was in a position where I felt like I had to justify my own story and my own voice. Wow. But I also was being put into a box based on other people's view of what they would be capable of in my situation. Because it was so physical, because it was so here, right? Like people anticipated what I was or wasn't capable of, but also what I did or didn't need. Okay? So I created an intellectual narrative, which was I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, I can do anything all by myself. And by the way, it served me very well, because I believed that if I set my mentality to something, my focus on something, my belief system on something, that I could accomplish anything. And it served me very well for a long time until it didn't. 20 years old, I'm going snowboarding. I've never let this stop me from anything. I live my life, brother. Like that's how I operate. Okay. I go down and I break my arm. I'll expedite the rest of that story, but I re-broke my arm, compound fracture in the same spot my arm came off at. And the following 10 months, I went through 7 surgeons who were all afraid to touch me, and a detached bone that literally just was dangling inside my arm, right? And the risk of losing my arm at any moment and reliving a lot of the experience I did at 7, now at 20, without all the people shepherding me through the process. What I realized is the power of our intellectual and mental narratives. It was a physical trauma, but I focused on putting myself in my head. And so again, it was, I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, nobody else, I don't need anybody's help. So guess what happened? When I'm in one of the most vulnerable places in my life, nobody was there. Yeah. And not because I didn't love them, not because they didn't love me, not because they didn't care about me, not because they didn't want to help me, but because they bought into my narrative. It wasn't their fault, it was mine. I was the one who created that narrative. And had I had the courage to ask for help, they would have been there, but they weren't, because I didn't have the courage to ask for the help.
Yeah.
Or I shifted that whole next period of time. I promise I'm bringing this full circle to answer this question. Yeah. Okay. That whole next period of time was focused on vulnerability and authenticity, human connection. If I can master that, then I will never be alone again based on my own mental narrative. And that served me very well for another 10, 13 years until I had some other health stuff come into my world and I started to feel in a way that I never had. My daughter and I were playing and we literally laid on the couch. She wraps her arm around my neck, gives me a kiss on the cheek and says, "Daddy, I love you." And I start crying. And immediately in that moment, I realized that if I hadn't ever experienced joy in that way, I also wasn't experiencing fear, pain, despair, loss in the same way. You see, I was confined into this little box of what I could feel. When I shut off physical pain, I also shut off emotional pain because it was beyond my ability to cope. I couldn't handle both at the same time. I don't think trauma, physical or emotional, necessarily is confined to, right? They're not mutually exclusive always. It's trauma that we as ourselves experience. Yeah. Now, how do we go through that process is completely different. But what I started to realize is human connection without emotion is not really human connection, right? Our intellectual narratives only serve us so far. And those that truly reach that next level of performance are those that understand the intellectual and emotional narratives that run their lives and understand how the traumas have shaped those narratives, emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, environmental conditioning based on that, and how they've modeled their life to be able to keep themselves safe based on that trauma and whatever their ability to cope is. So the ones that truly reach the highest level of performance are those that understand intellectual and emotional narratives and can balance and regulate between the two. So really it's those who can think about their thinking, think about their feeling, feel their thinking and feel their feeling. It's in that quadrant that success lives. So I don't think it's so easy to separate physical and emotional trauma. The reality of it is we experience trauma. Now, how do we cope? How do we move through that? How do we feel so that we can heal? That's a whole nother question.
That's powerful, my man. I hope, and I'm distilling a couple points out of this. I think one is, the compartmentalization, or like you only have so much bandwidth to be able to work on what you're working on, right? So you might be working on the physical elements and conditioning your way so that you can get through that. And if you don't circle back, or if you can't sit beside yourself or be really aware of the other things that you need to work on, or the other blind spots, vulnerabilities that you have, they will pile up, and then you will eventually have to face them in some way, shape, or form. I think the other thing is, you were talking about conditioning those around you. Like that is such a profound concept, because I'm realizing more and more, and I've had a couple guests that have kind of pulled a similar thread on the podcast, but I can't help to think how often we may be conditioning those around us because we don't want to be vulnerable, because we don't necessarily feel like they're the right person. I don't know exactly kind of where to go from there, but it's interesting, because you could have asked maybe 50 people in your life for help, and they certainly
and they would have been there, by the way.
They would have been there.
They would have been there had I asked. So what you just picked up on, I think, is a concept that I haven't really riffed on before, but I think is actually extremely powerful. Because I talk, again, dude, I'm just going to honor you as a host. You've now dropped 2 bomb questions that I've never been asked before. And so like, I get excited when I can come here and like think a different way, feel a different way. Like, brother, like I'm jacked right now, Jake. Like, this is powerful. The thing is, I always say often, right? Like in life in general, like we all get stuck. It's okay to be stuck. It's not okay to stay stuck. Right. But so often people think that the next step to get unstuck is a combination of strategy and tactics. Like literally, if I just implement this in my life, I'll be free. If I do this, or I get here, I'll be okay. I'll be happy. I'll be this. Right. But where I'm going with this is, it's like, when we do that, we're also not really paying attention to the root problem that's keeping us on our same self-defeating path. You see, what keeps us stuck is not strategy and tactics, because they're only going to get us so far. It's a combination of emotional triggers, environment or behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning. And when you talk about conditioning other people, it's really a byproduct of those 3 things, right? So when we condition the people in our lives, you even talked about, it might be because we can't be vulnerable. We can't show that insecurity. We don't have that level of trust. Are we even aware that we feel that way around this person?
Yeah.
Like, think about that. Like, I think there is so much conditioning that takes place in our life that is unintentional. It is unaware. So this goes back to my whole idea of awareness and intentionality, right? We know that our minds process 11 million bits of information per second, but we're only consciously aware of about 40. So we're largely led by the unconscious, right? So until we go through a systematic process of moving the unconscious to the conscious, the unaware to the aware, it's going to feel like we're a victim. It's going to feel like life is fate. It's going to feel like we have no influence or control over our destinies.
Yeah.
I told you that for 13 years, I created a narrative that conditioned the people in my life, and I didn't even know I was doing it. 13 years. I conditioned the people in my life, and I didn't know I was doing it. And I would argue that I'm one of the more aware people that I've met. And I don't say that arrogantly. I just know I've put in the work to become very aware and to connect my mind and my body and make sure that I'm seeing things holistically, right? Like, I know that. But if I went 13 years without understanding how I was conditioning people in my life, imagine that. I'm going to one-up you to a whole nother level. I'm going to share a really recent story that I haven't even shared a whole lot yet.
Let's do it.
Okay. You talk about 13 years of conditioning people in my life. I've got a better one for you. I've got a 14-year example that I just unpacked. In March 4th, 5th, and 6th, would have told you that I was in the best place in my marriage that I've ever been in my life. And my wife would have said the same thing. March 6th, which just so happened to be the exact date that I've thought about for 3 years, by the way. Not because of what happened afterwards, but because it was the day that my son was the exact same age I was on my accident. So March 6th, 2020, my son was to the day the same age I was when my accident took place. And for whatever reason, I've thought about it for 3 years. The date was unbelievably profound because my wife and I became aware of some things that we were then able to start to unpack. April 4th, 5th, and 6th, I didn't know if I was going to be married for another month, let alone for a year. You in Montana heard portions of this story, but you didn't hear the whole bit, right? Because it wasn't totally complete yet. The completion to the story that you started to hear started to take place the Sunday I got back from Montana. So you heard the first part, which was my wife owned her truth for the first time in 14 years. And she articulated to me, by the way, a guy who's committing the rest of his life to helping people discover who they are and have freedom in their lives. My partner, my spouse, my most important human being, my greatest mentor, coach, lover, friend, everything that I've ever had, expressed to me that things I did in our marriage 10, 12, 14 years ago caused her to lose who she was. Now, the part that got complete when I got back the weekend after started to unpack. And what she really meant with that is that there was elements of temper and control that were starting to enter into my world. Neither of which we had completely understood at that moment, but we understand now. But a week later, what became very apparent is that I've been angry for a really long time, Jake.
In what way?
And that anger was buried so deep, it could barely be excavated, brother. Like I didn't even know it was there. And when I started to own that externally to people in my life, they were like, you're not an angry person. I was like, I know, I didn't know I was either. But here's the deal. I would get triggered in a way that I was not even intentionally or aware, knowing that there would be an edge that I would create that would make my wife and my kids sometimes feel unsafe. Not because I was screaming, not because I was yelling, not because I was hitting them, not because I was, not even the words that I chose, just the energy that I put out sometimes. I was unaware of that. And I created patterns in our house that I conditioned my family to think that I was a certain way based on an emotional trigger and a behavioral pattern that was long before them that they were now starting to feel the benefit of. That Sunday when I realized this, I literally looked at my wife, I promised her in the face, to the eyeball to eyeball, like we will never feel a negative impact from anger in my house again as a result of me. And I'm proud to say 3 months later, that's the truth. It's not happened. And so we've embraced the pains required to like establish suffering or to really avoid suffering in our lives. But the reason I went down that path, Jake, I'm not sure that the majority of people actually understand how they're conditioning people in their lives because they aren't clear and aware of where they're showing up, who they are, who are the people that need to be in their lives, who are they serving, and understanding that the resistance and the blocks that they're experiencing begin and end with them.
Yeah.
The victim mentality is pointing at our relationships and saying, well, I'm lonely, I'm afraid, I'm lost. My spouse doesn't love me. They don't do this. But do we know how we're either pushing them away or pulling them towards us? We definitely condition our environments and the people around us. The question is, do we know how?
You know, and maybe a good analogy to kind of riff on here as well that I'm picking up on is there are things that we can do to upgrade various areas of our life, whether it's closing a skills gap, whether it's finding a blind spot, those types of things. And when you think about like computers, for instance, you're going to do a software update every now and then. You're going to kind of improve every now and then. For Windows, it was about every 5 to 7 years. There's an operating system update that happens, right?
100%.
Full scale operating system up here. And I think that that's kind of what you're talking about here
100%.
is like I have to change fundamentally the click path of how I get to things now and how I think about things now. And it doesn't necessarily change the fact that the applications are going to be there and available, but how you get to them, by what means and in what way, I think is really critical. So
beautiful analogy. I mean, dude, like we've got people who are literally drinking from a gigabyte stream, but they're operating on Windows 95.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, that's a great analogy. Like there are people who have literally operated off the same set of beliefs, the same set of feelings, the same operating system for 30, 40, 50 years in their lives.
Yeah.
Right. And oh, by the way, this happens all the time. This is one of the things that I do with individuals. I help giants become legends by helping them grab what they think is just out of their grasp. I've got a 68-year-old client that literally financially independent, consultant, coach, runs multiple businesses. Externally, he's worked with multiple coaches in his life. Truthfully, he didn't understand that the root of all of his problems that he had really started to manifest in his life was that he suffered from a deep and profound lack of self-worth that was prompted by dynamics in his life that happened from age 14 to age 19. Literally, 50 years he's been suffering because of his lack of self-worth and not understanding how he was conditioning the people in his life and in his businesses to operate because of the way he couldn't show up for himself. 50 years he suffered. 50 years he operated off that same operating system, right? And that same operating system that tried to upgrade multiple times, he couldn't. And so all he felt was that resistance in between, the gap between where we're at in the current world and what he was seeing, but what he was feeling. And when our intellectual narratives don't match with what we're feeling, that's resistance. It tells us we need to pause and pay attention to something.
Pay attention to the resistance. I love that. Hey, as we continue to pivot like down this path, your philosophy on pain and suffering is something that I cannot stop thinking about since you introduced it. Because it's kind of redefined the way that I look at the words, or at least it gives an additional definition set for me. So can you unpack that pain and suffering, and then maybe we can continue to build on this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we can take it where we need to go, but I thank you for bringing it back there. I think that is an important thing. So first I want to start with just making sure that I understand and that everybody understands when we're listening, that's like the narratives of the world. The world literally tells us to avoid, eliminate, or reduce pain. I mean, that's all we hear. It's like avoid, eliminate, or reduce pain, right? And we see people numbing it. We see people avoiding it. We see people taking pills. Like, it doesn't matter. And by the way, I'm not bashing on anything that needs to be done around that, but let's just understand pain. And by the way, that's okay, because that's a natural evolutionary response for survival. 100 years ago, if you cut your leg, you could die, right? That's not the world we live in anymore, but like our bodies, again, our operating systems haven't caught up to the current world. Okay, like by the way, I'm stealing that. That is a beautiful analogy, Jake.
100%, my man.
All my greatest ideas have come from other people, Jake. So there you go. Thank you.
Helps you change lives, man. You're in such a great position to do that. But I love it.
Thank you. But yeah, but like literally, like 100 years have gone by, and we're still in this position, like fight or flight in every case, right? So let's understand pain. Pain is defined as short-term, intermittent to direct cause from something, and alleviated once that direct cause is removed, right? And then we as human beings do what we always do, and we screw it up further. We put adjectives in front of it to change the organic definition. So we now have acute and chronic. Acute maintains the definition, but chronic inherently changes it because it implies that pain is no longer short-term and it persists after that direct cause is removed. Let's stop calling that chronic pain and let's call it what it really is, suffering. Right? We don't want to admit that suffering exists in our lives, particularly when it's a direct result of our choices. Whereas pain gets lots of attention because we feel it. It's right there. We don't want to experience it. We want to avoid it, right? But the interesting thing about pain is it cannot be measured independent of the person experiencing it. So the only thing we know is that pain is a universal human experience. That's the only conclusion we can draw about pain. Because how you experience it emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, or even perceived will be different than I do. Whereas suffering, right, creeps up on us often until we are so numb to its effects that the effects are irreversible. It literally creeps up on us. And again, we don't want to admit that it exists, particularly when it's a direct result of our choices. So let's understand this concept.
That is such a profound. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is such a profound statement. We do not want to admit that there's suffering in our lives, especially when it is a direct result of our actions.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to put a little.
By the way, I'm happy you drew attention to that because I think I think that's an important point to pause based on where you and I and the flow of this conversation has gone. Yeah. Let's understand the concept. Like, how do we apply this, right? And I'm not going to go deep on all the actual process, but I'm just going to hit some examples so that people can draw the correlations themselves. We can embrace the pain of hitting the gym for 30 minutes a day to avoid the suffering of aches and pains of a sedentary lifestyle. We can embrace the pain of a difficult conversation with a loved one or spouse to avoid the suffering of being stuck in a loveless marriage that's going to end in divorce, or being stuck in a marriage when we actually want divorce. We can embrace the pain of the fit our kids are sure to throw by having them put down their mobile devices at the dinner table to avoid the suffering of years of lost meaningful connection and conversation that we'll just never get back. As business owners, we can embrace the pain of firing our top salesperson who's contributing the most to top line growth to avoid the suffering of stagnant growth and losing all our other top talent because they were the greatest cancer in our culture. And the list goes on, right? So I believe that we all must choose our pain or our suffering will choose us.
What a perspective. I struggle with the word suffering because I use it. I probably use it incorrectly based on your definition here, because like there's a lot of working out or like jujitsu methodology or like whatever, where it's like, you got to kind of embrace the suck and embrace the suffering. But really what you're doing is you're embracing the pain, and the suffering is the long-term, the chronic condition that's associated with it. I was also breaking down the word a couple months ago. And actually I put a post out on social media because I was fascinated with suffering. And then you've kind of built on it when I heard you speak and as we're talking now, but there's a lot of different ways that you can translate something in Latin. Obviously there's words that can mean, but Sue means two. And fur, one of the possible translations is to carry. And so like I've been obsessed with the idea of when you view suffering as something you carry, it's a lot more possible to let go, right? From that standpoint, like you are choosing to then carry that suffering. And I think what you're drawing the really important point to on the prerequisite of that is you have to choose the pain that you're going to embrace, because you will be carrying something, right?
Yeah.
In your life, you're going to have to carry, and to what level, I guess, is what you decide and what you decide to let go.
You're giving me chills again, brother. I'm loving this conversation more than I can even put measure to. Like, I just have to pause and say that, Jake. You're a deep dude, and that's powerful. Here's the thing. Just because you can carry the weight doesn't mean it's not heavy.
Yes.
And the thing is when you look at suffering, I think so much suffering exists by what isn't said, what people don't feel like they have the permission or words for how they feel. And so often those are things that can be prevented. So when you think about it, right, so much suffering exists from just what you talked about, deciding to carry the weight. I have a client that for 35 years who had one of the most profound traumas I have ever heard the story on. And I'm not going to share those details of that story. That's her story to tell. But there was literally 2 people on the planet who knew that she had experienced this suffering, her parents. 35 years she carried it with her. 35 years she literally built walls up around herself to protect herself because she believed that vulnerability wasn't there. 35 years she felt like nobody cared. She didn't feel worthy of the feelings that she had, which was just feeling stuck, feeling like she wasn't seen, feeling isolated, feeling just constantly in pain. Like, truthfully, in pain, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. 35 years she carried this with her to the point that it almost crushed her. The thing is, when we put up armor because we don't want to be vulnerable, what we don't realize is that armor, right, gets layered on. And it not only gets layered on, but imagine taking a weight. You talked about going to the gym. Take a 10-pound weight, hold it out in front of you. Just hold it out in front of you. Doesn't feel that heavy in the beginning, but the longer you hold it out there with no additional support, the more it just starts to absolutely wear on you. And it doesn't mean you can't hold it, but it doesn't mean it's not damn heavy, right? That armor, when we carry it longer and longer, what we don't realize is we think it's protecting us, but what it's actually doing is progressively crushing us the longer we carry it. It literally crushes us to the point that we can't breathe, we can't move, we can't think, we can't experience outside of that container that we've created to keep ourselves safe. Joy, freedom, and fulfillment can't exist in that silo. They can't exist in that vacuum of armor. And so many people who think it's impossible, right, just need to start to do the work and recognize that had this person actually been able to let her guard down, talk to somebody even 20 years ago, right, who could see her, who could validate her feelings, who could help her understand them, who could understand how they turned into patterns in her life, who could understand how she kept herself small and avoiding life, truly avoiding life to keep herself safe, could just show her a glimmer of freedom. And that's all she would need to have enough purpose to overtake the pains required to go on this journey. And so in this particular case, like, that's what you're talking about. Suffering is what you don't see creeping up. Suffering is when you wake up one day and you're 50 and you realize for 30 years you've been carrying something with you that you need to release.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not about the tension and holding on to this thing. It's about literally when we relax, that's when it happens. Think about myofascial release in the gym, right? When you're doing stretching, you tighten the muscle and then let it fully release after it was already relaxed. That's when you get deep. That's when you have the ability to move forward. It's no different with our emotions.
Well, and I touched on this in the intro, but this seems like a really clean segue as well, is your approach to this. It sounds like it's around radical authenticity for those, like finding out who it is that you are, what makes you unique or special, or, I don't know what the framework is backing it. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit on how you help people bridge that gap into a radical awareness of who they are so that they can confront some of those traumas, those issues, and help them optimize in life.
Yeah. I'm gonna say a couple of statements that I haven't ever really actually connected to this concept before, but I think are really important. My wife and I talk a lot about our kids, and helping them be exactly who they are is a very simple concept. Allowing them to do things and express themselves in ways that make their hearts happy. Radical authenticity is not a very complicated thing, but the world makes it really hard. Okay. And the other thing is, I think that to do that, when you own, like, and you can do the things that make your heart happy, it's also about owning your truth, not anybody else's truth. It's about allowing your voice to be louder than the voices of the world. But what happens, right? And I'll describe what radical authenticity is in just a second, but we need to understand this. Because when we have children, anybody who's got kids or been around kids knows this. We're born as the brightest, most authentic, bright, burning light we will ever be, ever. Right? And then what happens as we enter into the world and we grow up and we start doing these things, our parents, teachers, coaches, employers start literally layering things on top of us. You should be this, you shouldn't be that. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. You should chase that amount of money, you shouldn't chase that amount of money. You should have that haircut, definitely you shouldn't have that haircut. You should chase that for your spouse, you shouldn't chase that. Right? And what we get lost in all these shoulds, because the reality of it is should is a shame-based word because it implies that whatever we're doing isn't good enough. Whoever we are isn't good enough. And so we're conditioned to chase the what's in the world, what house, what car, what amount of money, right? What amount of success. And we end up losing the who in the process even further until one day we wake up and we're just an empty shell of who we once were. So radical authenticity is about shedding the layers of what the world has told us to do and getting back to the core of who we are. Because when we get back to the core of who we are, we understand who we are, we understand who we're doing this for, we understand who we're serving, who we're trying to impact, then all the what's in our life become a manifestation of the who. It's not that what doesn't matter, it's just that who is before what. Just like people are before profits. You just flip it. They're both important. Profits are important. What's important? But if we focus on the who and the people, right, then all of a sudden we can start to bring ourselves back to this place of radical authenticity. Radical authenticity is not an unfiltered version of who you are. It's not, I can do anything and say anything because this is my truth. So I can go around and I can just own this stuff. And because this is how I believe, I can create damage and hurt in other people's lives.
Throw whiskey in people's faces.
I mean, legit, that's not what it is. That's not radical authenticity, right? But radical authenticity is about really understanding, right, the things that make you tick, the things that make you happy, the things that bring you joy, freedom, and fulfillment. And the things that bring you down, right? The people and sources that you leave feeling not worthy, you feel leaving depleted, you feel leaving negative. Right? Radical authenticity is turning into the stuff that you know brings you life, that brings you energy, that doesn't make you feel worn out, that makes you feel like you can run another marathon. And we all have those things that light us up. We all have those things that create light into our lives, that bring happiness into our hearts. Radical authenticity is when we start to be able to live a no limits life, because it's about creating a life of intentional alignment based around who we are. They can become self-regulating over time. We know what fits and what doesn't. It's about freeing ourselves from the box that the world has tried to shove us in because they have no other place to define or tell us how to accept us. It's why so many people lose who they are. And all I'm trying to do is usher in the era of who right now, brother. Because if we can usher in the era of who and get us to focus on who instead of before what, if we can focus on people over profits, again, this is where the impact of 1 billion lives starts to come into place. This is where joy, freedom, and fulfillment starts to exist. Can you imagine a world where none of us have guards up, who aren't triggered constantly, who understand that intent is aligned, and we're looking for ways to live the human experience together, to unify us so that we can just be happy? It's not that complicated, but it's really messy.
Well, hey, you know, as we're kind of rounding out the conversation here, you mentioned fatherhood. I think you and I are in pretty similar positions as far as timing and age. I got a 7-year-old son. I got a 5-year-old daughter. I think it's pretty close.
Exactly the same. Yes.
Exactly the same. And I've put a lot of thought, especially in the last 2 years, in the way that I show up as a father. And one question that it's very easy to be critical of yourself. It's very easy to attribute value to all the actions that you do and then how it's going to manifest and fucking them up long-term, for lack of better words. But I wanted to ask this because, and I wasn't planning on asking, but I'm going to ask it now, which is, you know, you clearly are putting a lot of thought into the way that you're showing up for your children and showing up for your family. You're changing things along the way. You're figuring yourself out. What are you doing really well as a father? What are you proud of right now? And, you know, maybe if there's any stories that go along with that, but just so interested in kind of sharing that connection with other men who drop by the podcast.
Man, this has got to be one of my favorite interviews I maybe have ever done, Jake. Thank you for honoring the pause. I had to sit with that for a second. I think the thing that I'm realizing and the thing that I'm doing very well right now And it's an extension of a thought that existed before, but it also connects to the conditioning of people in our lives that you asked earlier. Everything begins and ends with you. When I was able to own my own truth and stand into some of the stuff I shared with anger, temper control that I was blind to, that again, weren't having active damage real time. It wasn't like I was having outbursts, right? Like, and I don't say that to defend myself. I'm owning everything about what led into that. But it's just so funny that around that same time, our children started to have little bits of tempers and like little bit of hard time handling their emotions. And like we were having bigger outbursts in the house, right? And they were feeding off of the example that they were seeing energetically, even if they weren't seeing the ramifications of the actions as a result of the energy. And they at 5 and 7 don't know how to deal with that. Those are big emotions: anger, frustration, rage, shame. That's a big emotion that most adults can't handle. A 5 and a 7-year-old certainly don't know what's going on, but they do know how they feel. They know what they're feeling inside. They know what they're like, what they're frustrated about. But again, that tension that they're existing is based on their, again, gap and the resistance between their intellectual belief on what happened and what they're feeling inside, and trying to reconcile between the two. So what I'm doing really well right now is I'm able to, for the first time, I think in my life, take my given gifts, my ability to read people, my ability to help people navigate their own unique experiences, own it real time for myself and model it in a really positive way. And in doing that, also create an even deeper bond, connection, and trust with my children, and be able to see that within a matter of months, generational cycles, generational patterns that have been passed down on both sides of our family for multiple generations, we now have an opportunity to break. And so I'm really, really proud about the work that my wife and I are putting in. It's a lot of work for me right now, but she's also having to put in a lot of work to make sure that we are both putting ourselves in a position where we can be neutral and see everything exactly for what it is. One of my favorite quotes is from Ryan Holiday, and then the obstacle is the way, right? That there is no good or bad without us. There's the event that happens and the story we tell ourselves about it. We're trying to make sure that we tell the most neutral, honest truth in our stories in every minute that aren't charged by our triggers, patterns, or conditioning. And we're trying to help our kids do the same.
I love that. Absolutely, man. What a powerful statement. What a powerful reflection too. And, I've really tried to change my role instead of the person who gives them my opinion piece or my thought piece on everything that comes up, because I really can paint it on thick. This is the way that you should view it. This is the way that you should see it. And as I hear my son specifically repeat some of those things out of the context that's locked in my mind, I'm realizing that the complexity and the nuance is lost, and it's his narrative to build. And it's my responsibility to try to help him get to those bullet points, get to the facts. And so I love what you're saying there. And I definitely want to re-listen to that and, see how I can fold it into my day-to-day, because what a cool thing to do, and what a cool perspective you and your wife have of parenting.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a journey, man. There's no manual. We're, and here's the thing, we're guaranteed to probably screw our kids up too.
100%. I'm prepared, man.
When I say I'm breaking generational patterns and cycles, I might be creating new ones. I don't know. I'm trying to do the best I can every minute. I'm just like, everybody else, man. It's day by day, life by life, moment by moment. And if we do that and just try to calibrate and refine, hopefully we'll find the journey.
And hey, Brian, as we're closing out here, what are you up to now? Like COVID's kind of heading, at least times are changing, opportunities for someone like yourself, who's a well-known, well-established motivational speaker and someone who typically gets out there. Like, what's coming up for you? And then also, where do people find you, social media, otherwise? What's the best way to connect with you?
So I'm really excited for the world to open back up. Especially with what I do with people, although I've found a way to model it and be pretty effective with it through a screen, it's just not the same. So I'm very excited. I've been getting on stages again. And I've already got talks booked all the way through October this year, on multiple different occasions. So I don't say that to brag. It's so exciting to actually be going out on stages again. Yeah. You and I met at an opportunity to be on a live stage, one of the first 4 I was on in the last year. Like that's meaningful. So I'm really excited about that. And then we're just, honestly, we have a whole lot of things that are in the works right now to just amplify and shorten the curve to impacting those billion lives. So we've got multiple different entities that we're spinning up that are all really around like helping people discover who they are, reach the people that they want to work with or who they need to impact, represent who they are to the world. And so we've got literally multiple different verticals that are really helping people along that journey. So you can find us at brianbogert.com. That's the best place right now. You'll see to impact a billion lives. We're very aware that 99.9999999% will never pay us $1, and we're very okay with that because we know those that will lean in and invest in themselves will substantiate all the resources we need to perpetuate that impact. So the reason I say that is if you see anything that resonates, that connects with you, this is not a sales tactic. This is genuinely, I need help. The only way we reach that billion is through collective impact. The only way we reach that billion is when people are perpetuating the messages, when they're moved by something we create, something we say, something we do, like, and they recognize that it resonates with them, it moved them. Moved people move people. So I'm just asking, if you get moved by anything that we connect with, can you continue that movement? Because that's the ripple effect that's going to create that impact. So, and if there's anything we can do to help you further, just let us know.
Perfect, man. Hey, I want to thank you, Juan, for your time. I know you're extremely busy, dropping by the podcast too. Your perspective, your story. I know that my listeners are going to appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to maybe having you on in the future as well, Brian, as things get going and we're all out here grinding. So thank you, sir. And thanks for your time.
Well, Jake, thanks for creating a platform for me to pour good into the world, brother. The answer is yes. We will be doing more together. I would be happy to join you anytime. I'm not kidding when I say this is one of my favorite interviews. And that didn't happen by coincidence. So we're going to be doing some cool stuff together. You're going to be a part of that collective impact, brother.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the opportunity. All right, man. Take care and safe travels.
All right. Take care.